Okay, George, this is a new thing right here. We are on the Shared Practices podcast, and we're going to wrap up a season together. This has been a long season. How many episodes are in season 2 of this podcast?
I think it's like more than 40, less than 50. I'm not sure on the exact number, but holy cow. It is a long season.
Mind-blowing.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it started a year ago.
Yeah, holy cow. So we had Scott Loon and Reese Harper, and that was like before you were even on the podcast. This has been a little bit of a journey. So I didn't expect acquisitions to take this long, in all honesty. But I don't think we've purposefully dragged out anything or taken longer on in an effort to like make a bigger season. That was not at all the intent.
No, and I think going back, obviously I was not part of the first 8 episodes.
Sure.
So going into future seasons, I think having such a long season and seeing how it played out, I think one thing that I really learned was how important chronology is. And so I think if we could go back in time and do it again, I would maybe put things in different orders.
Sure.
But, I think so much happened, and I think we were just so focused on getting great interviews out there that, we didn't necessarily think about, how to put them in what order.
Well, so to summarize for people, this whole season was to give you a roadmap of how to acquire a practice. And we've had a ton of guests on the show, and we were a little bit more systems focused at first, but we really switched to being like pure acquisitions driven in the season. And I think we've provided that. And not only have we provided that, we've then turned it around and turned it into a package deal that is a course now that people can take that's freestanding and summarizes all this, brings in different expert opinions. So there was this gap in like the world of what exists for people out of dental school who want to buy a practice. I feel like we've filled that in a couple different ways. If you want a bunch of free information via the podcast, we've got all that. If you want a deeper dive with things that are consolidated with video courses, we now have that too. So we've created something out of nothing. And I think it's pretty awesome.
And I think part of what took this season so long to do is the fact that there's really nothing out there about acquisitions in this level of detail. And so I think we had to do a lot of different things that maybe we won't have to do in future seasons because there'll be more information accessible to others.
Well, so, and I completely agree. With this episode, we're going to go through our biggest takeaways of how our perspective has changed on acquisitions. So this will be kind of a little bit of a summary, hopefully a little bit of debate and argument, and then also kind of a way to see how we've changed and grown and our perspective has shifted over this season. So if it's okay, I'll start. We'll start with my topics and then we'll bounce over to yours. And,
do you mind if I interrupt you just for a second?
Do it.
I just remembered on your first interview, I remember when you launched the podcast, you went on a lot of different podcasts talking about, promoting your podcast, and you talked about season 2 being a mini season about systems.
Yeah.
And it's funny to see how much has changed. I went back before I did my interview with Mark, and I listened to that one, and I was like, wow, there's so much has changed since Richard did this interview. And, you were talking about like a little mini season about systems, and it's now 40 plus episodes on acquisitions, but it's crazy. Anyway, I'll let you go.
That's hilarious. Well, so one of the first interviews that we had was with Reese Harper. And so he brought up this idea of he would rather do a startup. And I was like, no, like you're in the wrong season. We're doing acquisitions. But he talked about, if he were to buy $500,000 worth of patients. So that's what he kind of compared it to like a merger versus a startup, and how in a startup he'd end up with the equipment that he wanted, the location that he wanted, all these things. And he was kind of pro acquisition in that episode, or pro startup in that episode. And I think that we are still pro acquisition over pro startup if possible. And that when you can't find a practice to buy and you've exhausted not only brokers, but also you've tried on your own to find practices through networking, through the techniques that we talked about in this season, that's when you seriously look at like, okay, I've been doing everything I can to acquire a practice that fits what I want and nothing's coming along. Let's look hard at, can we do a startup here? Is this viable? I want you to talk with me. Do you even like the idea of a startup? Would you do a startup right now if you were forced to? If this deal fell through and all of the other practices that you analyzed and would buy next fell through, would you do a startup, and why?
Yeah, so I think well, let me just go back for a quick second.
Sure.
I don't want to say we're pro acquisition in the sense that, like, I think in general, people think more favorably of acquisitions than they do startups. I don't think we're unique in that. I think it's just, when you think of somebody who's doing a startup, their main concern is, a new patient flow and getting patients in place. When you buy a practice, you have that in place, and you have the luxury of going in there and tweaking things and getting bigger results because you have a large patient base. So I think that's really the big benefit. And you're buying existing cash flow. It's proven. It's very safe compared to a startup. We're not necessarily like these weird people who are pro acquisition. I think everybody.
I'm a weird person who's pro acquisition. No, I think it's the risk. I think people, when they think about buying a practice versus doing a startup, it all seems kind of risky and big. If you're straight out of dental school, if you haven't done this before, it seems overwhelming. The risk of starting from nothing and having no cash flow month after month, building things up, getting patients, getting credentials, insurances, having to do all the marketing, starting from scratch, it's just inherently a more difficult transition to do a startup. And not that it can't be done well, but an acquisition, just when you walk into that cash flow day one, even though you've had to buy this practice and it's going to have baggage, it's going to have problems, it's not going to be a perfect transition. At least you've got money coming in from patients, especially if you bought their accounts receivable. You literally have money coming in the door, and you've got a patient base and you've got people coming in. So I think the risk factor and the level of preparedness, I think an acquisition is just a little bit easier to bite off than a startup.
I think that last sentence is a great summary. And, going back to your question, would I do a startup? I mean, if that's my only option of getting into ownership, sure, of course. But, I talked about it in my first episode with you. I initially was planning on doing a startup, and I think the more I started looking at practices, the more I saw the potential in acquisitions. And I think now, if my deal, knock on wood, doesn't, I hope it doesn't fall through, but hypothetically, let's just say it does.
Sure.
Then I think I would initially apply all of the concepts and techniques that, we teach in the accelerator and on the podcast, because the whole point of us doing that and talking about it for so long is that you don't have to do a startup. You can find a great acquisition, because I think a lot of people in the industry would agree that a great acquisition, great cash flowing opportunity is preferred over a startup, and so that's what we're trying to put you in the best position in ownership. And I think that a lot of times is an acquisition, but not always, but a lot of times.
Well, okay. And so I'm going to jump to a point that we weren't going to discuss for a minute. So let's say that someone says, well, yeah, I want to buy a practice, but all the ones that I'm looking at kind of suck, or, they're asking too much. I'm looking at them. I'm applying the principles of valuation that you have in this season. There's not a great opportunity. Things are moving too fast. I'm having a hard time getting lending. Let's just take this issue of finding a practice. What would you tell to someone who says they can't find a practice to buy in a crowded metro and that this market is just too tough?
I would say that they're not. I mean, I would first ask them.
Some markets, some markets are really kind of awful.
Yeah, so, and I agree. And I think the reason why I've seen buyers really succeed using some really aggressive off-market strategies in very competitive markets. Some of the buyers that have talked to me and I've helped out, they've sent me like 30 deals, and it's like, for somebody to look at 30 practices, they're going to find something good.
Sure.
So I think I would tell that person, I would imagine somebody who says that may not be looking at enough practices, and they may just be talking to all their brokers thinking, well, I'm not having any luck with their brokers. And I think that could even be two things. It could be, one, the brokers, maybe you're not communicating with them in the right way, or two, maybe you need to start looking aggressively off market. And I think for people in that very crowded metro with a lot of buyers, the off-market approach is going to be your advantage against the other buyers.
So to summarize the off-market approaches, so we talked about, I think the default off-market approach is just to be talking to everyone that you possibly can and sharing the fact that you're looking for practice to buy. So whether that's other dentists, whether that's people online, whether that's not only just the brokers, but also other professionals, CPAs, lawyers, other dental professionals in your area that know of practices. So that should be the default off-market strategy. We've got 2 specific off-market strategies to add on top of that. So yours is one of them. So can you do like the
Elevator pitch?
The elevator pitch of your method?
Sure. So I think if you're looking in a very small area where you don't have a lot of options, like my criteria was I want to live where I'm living now and I want to be able to drive less than 25 minutes to work. So, I think you need to do you don't have a lot of practices to pick from, right? You don't have a lot of older doctors in your area who are looking to sell.
Sure.
So you need to focus your search on those offices and maybe call all of them and get to know all those dentists and talk to them, and maybe like do a tactic that people will respond to you more than just sending a letter or doing something else. You need to call those people, follow up with them multiple times. In my case, it took me 5 times to get in contact with my seller. So had I not known to keep calling that office, I would have never been where I am right now. So I think you just have to really focus on maybe a particular few offices and try your best to get those if you're in a small area.
Okay, so that's once you've decided that these few offices are worth buying, then you're really not aggressive, but persistent, knowing that you're not going to, you might get pushback, you might not have the perfect response, but it's that persistence that's going to get you there. So how do you know which are those few practices to be persistent with? So what are some key things from your demographic analysis that led you to the practices that you wanted?
We talked about how this has been a long season. I've learned a lot. I've learned not to get in the weeds. People are driving. And so I'm going to more or less, I would say that think of criteria that are important to you. And I would look at visibility as a big factor. So
Sure.
A very simple thing to do, go find all these older doctors' as practices, look at them on Google Street View and see how visible they are. That would be something I'd like to see initially. Maybe make it easy. But honestly, you're not going to have a whole ton of practices. I would make it your goal to go to lunch with every single doctor 55 and up in your area, and you'll find something.
That's awesome. No, that is a golden piece of advice right there. And that's the kind of networking that isn't very sexy and maybe is going to take a little bit of time, but is going to yield results. And it might do it in a roundabout way. It might take a little bit longer than you thought it might, but that's kind of how deals are found. That's how practices are found, is through kind of one by one going through and finding someone who's it matches. The fit is right and the practice is right and it works out.
And, on the same topic of talking to sellers, I think so much, obviously my personality on the podcast is very to the point, straightforward, numbers driven. But, when I'm talking to these older people, you can't be like that. You got to be relatable and personable. And like, it's so much about it is about the relationship you have with the seller as opposed to the numbers and the math.
I just have to laugh that you just like called everyone 55 plus, like these older people. Like you gotta talk to them like they're real human beings. You can't just be numbers and robot with them. I just want to point that out. Okay, keep going.
No, but like, you gotta, I want to make that point because I think sometimes my style can tend to lose it a little bit, where the relationship you have with sellers is the most important thing that'll get a deal done.
Yeah.
And your goal, I think Brian Pender, who we had on the podcast, talks about this exact topic. And like the gem from that episode was, he's like, your goal as a buyer is that every time the seller thinks of you for the rest of their life, they smile.
Yeah.
And, that's what you're going for.
Well, so that was perfect. I love kind of those things that have the different ways to think about that in the talking with them and building those relationships. Let's go real quick to the other way of finding practices in your market. So do you think there's a lot of value in sending out mailers and emails to potential sellers?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're picking the low-hanging fruit. I mean, with very little effort on your behalf. It's just a matter of, people talk about handwriting those things, and you can do that too. I mean, but personally, my style would be to just print those and get them out quickly. But, handwriting is a great touch. But, you send them out, and you get immediate responses within a couple weeks of them landing. It typically takes. But that's just a very, why not? I mean, it costs like 50 cents per office, and it's pretty straightforward. And I think for relatively low cost, low time investment, you could potentially find a great opportunity. So I think it's definitely good. And then when you call the practice, that doctor might be familiar with you. So I think it just all helps.
And the other part of this is that we are giving you the tools in this season to kind of understand the diamond, not the diamond in the rough, but like the practices that are really worth it and those that are not. And I feel like it's worth taking the extra effort to dig and to search and to put in, to send out these mailers, to talk to a bunch of dentists, to do all of this groundwork, because a good practice is going to be so much more profitable and so much more fulfilling and what you want it to be for a number of years to come. And if you kind of just walk into something that isn't profitable, that isn't what you wanted it to be, but it was like, oh, well, this is what the broker had, so that's what I went with. Is that too obvious to say? But I feel like
No, it's not, because I see it all the time. People, they really settle because they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And so, in some very select instances, I've like kind of okayed that a little bit with the buyer. I'm like, yeah, just, do it. But, for the most part, I think it's just there's so much to be said about. And you mentioned a point about practices selling for high percentages of collections in competitive markets. And I think going back to what Richard said about a good practice, the right practice for you, you should pay whatever it costs, and it'll cash flow and be worth it, and it'll be in the valuation range. So unless it's like north of 100% of collections, I would pretty much say that as a blanket statement.
Well, and I'm going to make a super quick analogy. I want you to throw a flag in the episode right now. If this analogy doesn't work, then we can edit it out later. But there's a really dumb game on the phone, like iPhone, Android, called Clash of Clans that I played in dental school. And in this game, this is deep.
I just threw the flag in.
Yeah, okay, throw the flag in. In this game, you attack other people, and you kind of like search through a bunch of other bases to attack. And towards the end of the game, as you get higher and higher and higher, it's harder to find a really good base to attack that's worth investing all your troops and time and effort, because it takes a while to build up your troops and all these things. But so at one point, I found myself like just searching and searching and searching and searching. And I'd sit there for like 10 minutes. And I was like, this game is stupid. Like, I'm just spending all my time searching for a base to attack. But when you'd finally find that base to attack, the payout was 100% worth it. And I also stopped playing the game at that point in time, because I was like, I'm literally falling asleep while I'm like searching for another base to attack. I feel like practice acquisition, you need to have a little bit of that mentality of like, you need to say next enough that when it finally comes along, this is the one that you have been looking for, you understand instinctively, like, this is worth it. This is worth all the time and effort that led up to it. And like, okay, I think this is going to work out. And so you've done the analysis, you've put in the time and the effort, you've searched and you've searched and you've searched, and then you move forward with it. So now you can put in the other flag of where we can resume the episode after we've cut out my Clash of Clans analogy. Do you think that worked?
I think that was good. No, I'm leaving it. And, nice. I think it's because, especially for somebody who's going to own one practice, which I think is the vast majority of our audience.
Sure.
The practice you buy has huge impact on your career. And so being patient and waiting, ideally with some really good off-market strategies, you don't have to be too patient, but waiting for the right practice to come along will pay itself over and over again in your career. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a huge decision. I think the practice you buy has a big impact. I think Derek, if there's one thing to be said, and he'll say it a lot too, he's good about recognizing it. A lot of his success came from his practice selection. And I think that's Derek Williams, by the way, we're talking about. He was on the podcast with me and Richard.
No, absolutely. And that is Derek's story of how he went broad. So he was like, okay, I'm going to go multi-state, and I'm going to be willing to move away from my family. I'm going to be willing to try something new, go rural. He kind of opened up. I am willing to go wherever I need to go to find a practice that allows me to crush it. And he did. And he found this amazing diamond in the rough, but he knew what he was looking for, and he knew how to say no to all these other practices. And then he doubles it and pays off all his student loans in the first year. And I think a lot of times people make up excuses of like, oh, I can't travel, or I can't go somewhere else, or in your case, you've set up criteria for yourself of, I do want to stay in Phoenix. It would be really easy to say, oh, well, I can't find a practice like that. I can't find an opportunity like that. So hopefully this gave people the tools and the vision to shoot a little bit higher and the tools to get there, rather than just being like, oh, well, here's what's available. I guess this is what I'm going to buy, and moving forward with it. So I think we've driven that point home. What do you think?
I mentioned in a previous episode that one of our biggest issues right now as young dentists and dental students is our student loan debt. It is one of the main reasons why we strive at Shared Practices to navigate the path to successful practice ownership. We aim to help our audience by doing everything we can to help you earn a great income as a dentist. It has always been my advice to tackle your student loan debt by refinancing your loans after becoming a practice owner with a stable income. Doing this allows you to avoid paying too much on your monthly interest. The key to refinancing your loans is selecting an experienced lender that will offer you a competitive interest rate. Did you know that most student loans charge the same rate regardless of how creditworthy you are? So chances are, as dentists, you're probably paying too much in monthly interest. Laurel Road, a division of Darien Rowan Bank, is a national leader in student lending. Laurel Road has helped medical professionals across the country refinance their federal and private dental school debt, saving thousands on interest over the life of their loans. Not only do they offer great terms and great service, ADA members receive an additional 0.25% rate discount on top of their new and already low rate for as long as they remain an ADA member. Fill out a 2-minute application and get pre-approved rates instantly if you are eligible. It's free to apply and there's no obligation to accept. For more information specific to your needs as a dentist and to submit an application, simply visit www.laurelroad.com/sharedpractices. Again, that is LAURELROAD.com/sharedpractices. Laurel Road is an equal housing and opportunity lender. All rates are subject to eligibility. Savings may vary. This is a paid promotion of student loan refinancing by Laurel Road. Yeah, no, I think I just want to add one thing about Derek's process because I was pretty involved in it. It was funny because by the time we had found that practice that he ended up buying, I had probably looked at more than 20 for him, like in depth.
Sure.
And I remember getting that practice and I was in class looking at it. And then I sent him back the email. I'm like, buy this one, like in all caps, exclamation mark. And then he ended up doing it and it just blew up. And I was like, wow, like it actually, like, that was the first time that, like, I really saw how big of an impact the proper selection can make. Obviously now we've seen it a lot, but, that was the first time. And that was really cool to see, and I was a second-year dental student. So it was pretty early on. And so it was fun. And that definitely changed my trajectory a little bit. So I think Derek has been a great case study for a lot of people.
I love that picture of you sitting in class D2 year, like you're just starting to salivate. Your eyes like grow wide. You're like, this is the practice. Do it.
No, and he submitted an offer very soon after. I mean, he was kind of on board too. So it was really fun to see that. It was like February. It was actually pretty late for him to just found it, but it closed and everything, and it was great.
That's awesome. Well, okay, so now I think we've really talked about that in depth of this. It's worth it to find the right practice, and here are the tools. And analyzing practices is kind of that next step that I didn't have a tool set for coming up with valuation. And this is what you were practicing, and this is what you were helping Derek with, and you were working with Hunter and Hunter's spreadsheet that you kind of then took and developed into your own. The main takeaway for me was that the number one question you should be asking is, what is the profit of this practice that I can replicate, and where's the opportunity for growth? And I feel like that is a framework that I can take and apply to any practice and anyone else who's looking at practices. Do you feel like there's anything else to that I'm kind of glazing over as I talk about like what you should be looking for with the specific numbers?
I don't want to get too in the weeds in this episode with those in episode concepts, but I think the one thing that I would say is looking at the EBITDA, which is the profit that you have from owning the business itself as opposed to just your own personal production. I think it's important because, you are going to be running this business and having a lot of headache that comes along with it, and you'll be taking on debt to run the business. And it should at least outweigh the debt. And it should, in addition to outweighing the debt, the EBITDA, the profit from the practice, it should also pay you an income to justify that work. So I think that would be the only thing that I'd add in this summary episode.
Awesome. And I like that idea that the EBITDA should pay for the debt of the practice plus paying you. And if that's like foreign language to anyone, you need to go back and listen to the Hunter Smith episodes. I think that was like season 2, episode
6, 7, and
8. And then later on, he was back for another couple more.
Yeah, it was 223. He was back.
Yeah, exactly. And then to the flip side of that, I really liked talking with Matt Porter and his perspective as a broker on how he comes up with the price of practices. And I love that he came out and said, like, the price of a practice is based on its current state, not on its potential. And don't let anyone try and like sell you a practice that's like, oh, well, you can grow it, you can do this, that, and the other, and that's why this is our asking price. To realize that it's like, no, the current price is based on where it's at right now, and then I need to analyze it for where it could go. And I don't know why, but like I just never heard that put into such black and white terms.
I have a lot of respect for Matt Porter after listening to that episode. I've never looked at one of the practices that he's had on the market, but usually when somebody sends me a practice, I don't even look at anything the broker says other than just the raw information from the seller. Because a lot of times it's just, I don't want to say anything rude, but it's not relevant. It really isn't. You need to make your own projections and calculations. I don't think you can rely on anything that they provide.
No, absolutely. And that's the hard part, is that, unfortunately numbers can be massaged, and hopefully we helped you guys kind of understand that and understand the raw data and what you can do with it from there, and why it's so important to have someone look at those numbers and not just take at face value what is given to you by a broker or by anyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's definitely one of the big takeaways of the season.
So brokers, we also talked with a couple lawyers. I think one of the things that I would recommend is to try and find a lawyer who has time-based compensation. So it's like, if the job takes longer, you pay them a little bit more. If it's quicker, you pay them less, rather than a lawyer who is just asking a big chunk up front, because there's no incentive for them to spend more time on your specific situation. And really just finding a lawyer who knows dental real estate, who knows acquisitions, I think it's completely worth it. So we mentioned this in a, I don't know if it was last episode or a few episodes ago. You switched lawyers during the season. So tell me about that.
Well, I switched my whole team. I started out and I had a banker, I had a CPA who was going to look at the practice for me, and I had a lawyer. And I switched my lawyer from a local guy here in Phoenix, great guy, to Rob Montgomery, who you had on the show.
Yeah.
And I switched my banker to David Alvey, who we've had on the show.
Sure.
And then instead of using a CPA for my valuation, I switched CPAs to a firm that does not do valuations. And I'm going to have Brian Pender, who we had on the show, the buyer's representative, do my valuation for me. And so those are 3 changes I made. And it's funny that, and like I hired Justin Short. I had a guest on the show, liked them, started talking to them, and decided to use them myself. And I think, one thing, I'm paying all of those people because, I believe in what, I think they're genuinely really good at what they do. And I think, I guess that's literally putting my money where my mouth is, in the fact that,
Sure.
we have them on the show, we interview them as an expert, and then, I use their services as well. And I think that's something that as an audience member, I would like for the host to do. So that's something, I didn't do it for that reason, but that is how I have changed my team as a result of the season.
I think it's ironic. I think it's awesome. And it's hard because they're on the show. So it's like, you're not going to come back in season 1 and like badmouth them. But like, I would love it if you had an episode after the acquisition of like what you expected and how things were different. And we can talk about those professionals. We can also talk about just kind of the whole process of, it's just like you think going to be one way and then it ends up going another direction. I think following your story is going to be a lot of value for our audience.
And this is definitely an aside, but I've thought about, as I'm coming up on my acquisition, how do I chronicle it for the podcast? Do I do a whole, I don't know. So maybe that's a discussion for the Facebook group, but I'm interested to see what you guys think on that. And I'm open to ideas. I have quite a few myself, so I'm interested to see how you guys want me to detail. I'm definitely going to be open throughout the process, as open as I can be, but I would like to see what you guys want from me there.
Well, and I think whether we do it like over time and release it over time, or whether we record a few things and then compile them together into one episode, or we'll have to talk about it. But I'm excited. I think it'll be awesome. And hopefully we're still doing this podcast when I'm free from the Army and do my own acquisition. So we'll see how your documentation goes. And then, 3 years later, I'll do mine.
So back to your acquisition. Is there anything that changed, anything that we haven't talked about already that changed for you as a result of the season?
One of the things was the simple idea, just like the acquisition versus startup. It's like, I want to do an acquisition and I believe I'll be able to kind of no matter what, but I would do a startup if I was forced to. Same thing with real estate. I would like to buy real estate associated with my practice, but I realized in the episode that it comes down to just the specifics of your deal. Like, look at the acquisition first, and then once it's a good practice to acquire, if the real estate's for sale, buy it. And it makes sense, like you've done the analysis and the real estate makes sense to buy, then sure, you can buy it. But don't let that be a big criteria. We don't want to go deep into it, but there can be a lot of opportunities with real estate and buying your practice location or renegotiating your lease. But I just really liked that simple fact of don't stress about whether or not you're buying the actual building. And it's just going to present itself as an opportunity one way or another, and you just move forward. Does that make sense?
No, and that was one of the things that I changed. So I entered the process. If the building was owned by the seller, I would have to buy it. Because you hear, not great things about sellers being landlords sometimes. But in the process of doing my deal, the practice itself has so much value that I see in it that I'm willing to compromise and not buy the building right away and have a first right of refusal with a buy option. So that was something that happened in my deal that made me change perspectives on the real estate. And so I think, definitely have an open mind to things as you go through it, because stuff will come up and you don't want to be fixed on an idea and lose a great opportunity because you were worrying about something that in hindsight or in the big picture is not very important.
Cool. No, that makes a lot of sense. So how about you? What have I not talked about that for you was a big change in your perspective?
So I'm going to talk about two things. I think it's funny that we're in two different spots in that you have no practice identified, you're open to multiple locations in the country, and you're experiencing this season with that perspective. And I think a good amount of our audience is there.
Sure.
When the season started and when I joined Shared Practices, I had a practice already identified. I had a deal pretty much loosely negotiated. So more of the stuff that affected me was the stuff after that point. So it's almost like you were the beginning of the season or the beginning of the chronology of the process, and I'm almost the second half.
Sure.
And so for me, I already talked about my team. I completely changed my team. That was one thing that I had done. But the other thing, and I talked about it in a previous episode, but I think it's important to talk about the insurance credentialing and how that affected my timeline.
Okay.
It pushed it back for me a month, and the reason was because I wanted to be fully credentialed with my insurance companies. That was Rob Montgomery's advice, was to be fully credentialed because the practice I'm buying is PPO practice, and so you don't want to go in there and not be credentialed with insurances. In Season 2, Episode 15, we had Marie Chatterley on the podcast, and she kind of told me the opposite perspective, where you go in, you buy the practice, and then, you just adjust the out-of-network versus in-network difference for the patients until you get credentialed. And her mindset was you don't lose the deal as a result of, an insurance credentialing issue. And I think she has a good point that you don't want to lose a practice because you are not able to meet the timeline of the seller. You adjust to their timeline, and then you can deal with the insurance thing as you own the practice. What I ended up doing is I ended up pushing closing back a month, but I'm going to be working in the practice for like 60 days as an associate to push the seller out 30 days early because it's important to him to retire soon. So that was something that we did to adjust that. But, it was just something that came up in my deal that was directly related to the podcast, and I thought it was worth mentioning.
Well, and you kind of have a flexible deal. So it's like he's willing to let you do this transition period, and he's willing to work with you. He doesn't have a bunch of offers coming on from all different angles because it's not listed. It's like a direct deal between you and him. So you're able to work something out like that, whereas maybe other people wouldn't have as much flexibility in that date and that timeline. So I think that definitely plays into it for you.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the big thing that Marie was talking about. It's like you don't want to lose the practice over this insurance credentialing issue that'll be just a few months in time before it's over. Rob, I think he knew from talking to me that my deal was very much not that loose, like not,
Sure.
some other buyer can't just come in and take it from me. At this point, I have a lot of goodwill built up with the seller. So I think he had the ability to do something a little bit more ideal. I'll put it that
No,
way.
and that's awesome. And that's the true value of these professionals who understand dental acquisitions and they understand your perspective. They've taken the time to sit down and realize the dynamics of your deal, and so they can make recommendations that are unique to you and your circumstances. And this would be one of those for sure. So you can kind of see that value of Rob Montgomery right there.
Yeah, and I think the next thing that really changed for me was talking about the actual after buying the practice and changing things. I think, first of all, if the seller is staying on, I think that always slows down your timeline for implementing changes, just because that's a natural, it's just not as much change happening in the office, and so it's harder to change a lot when the seller's still there.
Sure.
In my case, the seller's going to be there, so I think going into my acquisition, I have to have more of a mindset of making changes that are not as noticeable or not going to disturb their seller's, experience, and, at the same time doing what was necessary, but trying not to make unnecessary changes that are not going to have a big impact on the bottom line. And so that's something that I have to go into knowing.
And I think that's something that if someone wants to do what you're doing and buy straight out of school, they're going to be leaning more towards having the seller stay on, maybe changing a little bit less and kind of transitioning a little bit slower, rather than someone who's been out for 3 or 4 years and really knows what they want and can kind of come in and make up the difference and make those changes up front and have the seller leave immediately. I think that's just, you got to plan for that depending on how you're doing this transition. And as a new graduate, I think this makes a whole lot more sense than kind of kicking the seller out and then changing everything right up front. I think that's how you kind of can lose a lot of goodwill with the team and have things go south pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, I think that is a very good summary, and I think Sandy Pardue was a great guest to talk about that buyer who's more confident. And not saying I'm not confident, probably have too much confidence, but having being the kind of person that is able to take over practice entirely and is wanting to do that, and the seller happens to be leaving. I think that's that would lean more towards, I think, Sandy's method of there's a lot of change happening, might as well just change a lot of things to the way you want them. Versus Paul was much more conservative with his change. I think I'll fall somewhere in the middle, but I think knowing my situation, I need to be more cognizant of it, and I need to do things a little differently than maybe I would if the seller was not staying.
Well, and I think you know what you want, and so that's going to be the hard part for you. I think Derek kind of ran into this same thing where there was so many things that he wanted to do differently, and you can't implement them all at once. So it comes down to, what do I need to prioritize? Where should my attention go? What are the things that I can do with my team first that we can build on and move from there? Because if you just try and change everything right up front, you're going to get a lot of backlash. Things are going to fall through the cracks, and it's not going to be done well. So I think that's going to be your challenge, is going to be the patience to go from I know what I want to do with these specific systems in my practice, and having to choose and kind of stepwise go through that process.
I think you're right on. And can I address that point? Do we have?
Go for it.
We got time. So, a few things. First, my wife and I, we sat down, and something I recommend maybe all of you do, maybe even before looking for a practice, is really taking the time to outline what your perfect practice looks like in every way. What systems it has, how many employees, how much money are you making, everything like that. So now we know very, very vividly where we want to go with the office. And that's a conversation for another day, but having that idea in mind, if a natural change presents itself that's in that direction, we can take it without making it feel like we're actually making a change. It was just something suggested by a staff member. Great idea. Let's do it. Knowing in our head that that's going towards our ultimate end goal. That's one way that, I think we're planning on addressing that. The other way is, that's pretty much the reason why I hired Justin Short, is because we need somebody, my wife and I, to really help us know what to do in what order and how. So I think that's where he'll be invaluable, is his ability to help us, because he's not in the practice every day. He's more of our coach, and so he has more of a objective view of what needs to be done and help us accomplish our goals. And so I think that's how we plan on tackling that, but no doubt that is going to be our biggest, especially my personality type, that'll be my biggest issue. As you've probably noticed from the length of this season, acquiring a practice can be stressful. One of the biggest concerns facing new owners is what technology will they need in the practice to be successful? What will the new office look like to patients? Is it time for an upgrade? Should I keep the old chairs, the developing rooms, or the worn out carpet in the hallways? Whether you need to upgrade the equipment or totally redesign your office, Dental Planet is here to help. Dental Planet provides affordable, comprehensive services that simplify your expansion or renovation process while dramatically reducing your ROI by keeping costs low. Dental Planet can reduce your equipment costs by up to 60 to 40%. They have new and certified pre-owned digital imaging systems available as well. If you need to add operatories, complete 2 operatory packages start from $36,000. With multiple financing sources available, this makes Dental Planet even more affordable. All products include a warranty backed by a nationwide network of service providers. See how easy and affordable upgrading, replacing, or expanding can be when you team up with Dental Planet. Just mention shared practices to receive an additional discount on top of their already low prices. Learn more at dentalplanet.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes. That's dentalplanet.com. Again, mention shared practices to receive an additional discount on top of their already low prices.
Yeah, and I think what you said about having your kind of ideal practice in mind, I think that's maybe something that we glossed over with this episode, but I think that's exactly what people need to do. So people need to understand what they want, the practice model they want, the systems they want. And if you don't have a good picture of it, not that you'd want to delay ownership, but that's kind of one of the things that you need to start thinking about these things and building a plan of the type of practice that you want, so that you can identify when a practice lines up with that vision and when it doesn't, and when it's close enough that you can get there versus this is way off. This is not going to work. And you guys did that. And I think that's one of the things that's hopefully going to lead towards a lot of success with you guys in a very short period of time. So I don't know, if we need to do another episode of kind of vision and things like that with season 3 with a startup. And I think with a startup, it works really well too, because you can, from nothing, you can say, this is what I want my practice to look like. This is what I want my systems to look like, the facility, the technology, and you're not bounded by the existing practice. But I think the overarching theme of what I wanted people to get from this season was a hope that I can do this. Here are the steps. Here are other people who have done it. And here's what to look out for. Here's how I can mitigate some of the risk and the downfall of how it can go poorly. And hopefully give people that pathway to get out of some of their student loans, to move into ownership sooner, to have a more satisfying early career rather than having a bunch of associateships and other opportunities that don't work out the way that they'd want them to. So hopefully we've done that for you in some way. And also hopefully we haven't given people false hope that like, oh, this is just going to be easy and everyone can do it and everyone can buy these practices that double within a year. We know that we've provided some examples that are atypical. And the goal was to not make you feel bad if that doesn't end up being you, but more so that we can learn from those who are doing even better than we are. So what would you say to kind of wrap up this season for people?
Wow, I mean, I think it's hard to, it's I can't believe it's been so long. We've talked about so much. It's almost weird to finish it up. I feel like people know us as an acquisitions podcast, and that's I guess what we've been. But, I would really just leave people with the idea that start with the end in mind and think about what you want 5 years after you begin ownership. And the whole process of the acquisition, each step of the way, you need to tailor it towards your end goal. And so your end goal affects the whole thing. And so I would really encourage everybody to have a good idea of what you're looking for in your career and your life as a dentist, and then use all the information we provided to guide you towards whatever you want. And I think that's ultimately what we want, is to help everybody get what they want. So I think that's what I would say to wrap things up.
Awesome. Well, hopefully, like we've said, this has been beneficial for you. And despite the fact that neither of us at this moment in time have actually acquired a practice, and we understand that it's kind of ridiculous that we did an entire season on acquisitions, not having done an acquisition ourselves. And you're in the middle of one. You're way closer than I am. But you've been helping people since D2 year analyze and acquire practices. So hopefully you guys have seen our growth over this season and our learning. And that's really what we wanted is we wanted to share this process and share this experience. So thanks for hanging in there for so many episodes for this whole season. And hopefully we're going to be helping you guys buy a bunch of good practices and doing the same thing for us.
And Richard, before we leave, do you want to foreshadow to season 3? I think our audience, I think Richard will be. I'll let you kind of tell the audience what to expect for season 3 in terms of hosts and whatnot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So some of our audience may know that like this has been a little bit of a crazy journey for me being in an Army residency while doing this podcast, which my wife at many points has questioned my sanity and it's come to a head at multiple points. So George has been amazing at stepping up and really producing the bulk of the last half of this content for this season. I am like at the peak of like, I just have to get everything done. I have to get my master's thesis written, all of these different projects in before I graduate. So season 3 is going to be with a new host. So I want you to introduce our new host. I'm going to step away for a period of time until I can finish my residency, have my life back, have my sanity back, and then I'll be back kind of taking over as soon as we can so that you can go on to move forward with your acquisition and take over this practice. So why don't you introduce your co-host for season 3?
Well, I found somebody who I respect a lot and related to startups. And so what I wanted, so I had known Richard, technically has really been trying to cut back on things that he's doing for the podcast and focus on other priorities in his life, really since I think September. And so I've had a lot of time to think about knowing that season 3 was coming and I just tried to think about what I would want in a co-host. And what I ended up doing is I found somebody, really good friend of ours, actually is how I think I met Richard through this individual. And he is in the process of doing a startup. And now he's, I think, almost 8 months in to his startup. And so the co-host for season 3 will be Jonas Ashbaugh. And you'll meet him next episode, I guess. It'll be the first episode of season 3, which we haven't recorded yet. But you'll meet him, and he's very similar to me in that he's done a lot of research. And I think that's something that our audience has come to like is the level of detail and content that we provide. And so that's something I wanted to make sure we carry on in Richard's hiatus. And so that's something that we'll have in season 3, and I'm really looking forward to it. He's very passionate about startups, and that was the kind of person I was looking for in season 3. So you guys will get to know Jonas pretty well. He's a really good friend of ours, someone that I think will teach everybody a lot, and that's what we're going for.
Well, and the thing that I'm, besides Jonas being an awesome guy, the thing I'm really excited about Jonas being on the season is that he's on the other side of this journey. Like he's just done it rather than us who are kind of like looking forward to it. He's got the perspective of, okay, I've been through this. I've done the research. I thought I knew it was going to go A, B, and C, and it didn't. It went this other direction. So he'll have his immediate experience. And then you guys are lining up a number of startup stories from other dentists who have done startups. And that's like my favorite thing in a podcast is actual boot on the grounds stories and examples of how you should and shouldn't do things through learning on the fly, through actually doing it and what changes. I think that is going to be one of the most valuable parts of season 3 is just hearing the startup stories of a bunch of different dentists. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're also looking forward to it. It'll be about maybe half and half, the blend of content in related to professionals versus actual stories teaching us what we need to do going into startup. So it'll be a great season. I'm really looking forward to recording the rest of it. It's something we're working on for a while, so I think you guys are really going to enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for sticking around. Hopefully this last recap episode really kind of consolidated some of the key points and principles and concepts of season 2 for you guys. Thank you guys for being patient with me leaving the podcast for a little bit. I'm going to miss you guys for a few episodes, but I'll be back this next summer. So thanks for being on the Shared Practices podcast. Please leave us a review. I think we're like over 130. Like there's only a few podcasts in dentistry that actually have more reviews than us. So thank you guys so much for all of that.
There is only one.
What are we at?
Oh, I think we passed Tachus.
Yeah.
So now we have the Dental Hacks podcast is the only podcast in dentistry that has more reviews, which is crazy considering our age. We're one of the youngest. So that goes to show how awesome of an audience we have.
Thank you guys. No, we really appreciate it. We couldn't do without you guys, and you're why we're making this content. So awesome. We will talk to you guys next time on the Shared Practices podcast.